When I moved to this neighborhood, everything seemed perfect. But, as every place has its own private hell, mine went by the name of Karen. And no, she wasn't just an annoying neighbor who complained when someone mowed her lawn on Sunday. She was the living embodiment of the HOA, the kind of person who thought she could rule the neighborhood like an absolute queen. On the first day, before I'd even finished unloading the move, there was already a note nailed to my door. Something about the color of my facade not being in accordance with the HOA's aesthetic guidelines. I laughed, thinking it was a prank. Little did I know that it was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the woman seemed obsessed with me. Any little thing was grounds for a ridiculous notification. My lawn was 1 centimeter higher than allowed. My garbage can was not in its proper place. My car was parked at an irregular angle. If I breathed out of proportion, I'd probably get a warning about inadequate oxygen use. I tried to ignore it. I tried to laugh it off, but it always came back, more and more unbearable. The final straw came when an HOA officer showed up at my door with a formal warning that my house was not in compliance with the rules, and that, if I didn't correct the infractions, I could face fines. Absurd fines, by the way. Fines that seemed to have been invented by a bored psychopath with a calculator. I began to realize that this woman didn't just want me to follow the HOA's rules, she wanted me to leave, as if my mere existence in the neighborhood was a personal affront to her. The situation escalated ridiculously. One morning, I woke up to deafening classical music coming from her house, something so loud that even the dogs in the street were barking in desperation. That same day, I found my gate open and my mailbox mysteriously folded up as if a rhinoceros had tap-danced on it. But the icing on the cake came one cold night, when I was almost asleep, and a loud noise made my heart leap out of my chest. A crash, followed by the crystalline sound of shattering glass. I ran into the living room, still a little groggy, and saw the shards scattered across the floor. Someone had just smashed one of my windows. I took a deep breath, trying to process what was happening. A random attack? Some vandal? But something told me it was something much more predictable and annoying. I went to my computer, accessed the security cameras, and there she was, Karen, with a crowbar in her hand. If this were a movie, that would be the moment when I would pause to look directly at the camera and say, that's all I needed. But at that moment, all I could feel was a mixture of anger and amusement. Did she really think she could do this and get away with it? If there was one thing this woman had forgotten, it was that technology was not her ally. And my God, I was about to use it against her in the best possible way. If there's one thing I've learned in this life, it's that some people really don't understand the concept of consequences. And Karen? Oh, that woman was their queen. She lived as if the world was one big amusement park, where she could do whatever she wanted. And, at the end of the day, the staff would come and clean up the mess for her. But this time, she had gotten herself into the wrong mess. I stood there, staring at the computer screen, trying to absorb the ridiculous scene before my eyes. The woman was standing there, in the middle of the night, as if she were a retired ninja who had decided to return to active life just to torment me. Only, unlike a ninja, she had no stealth skills whatsoever. The footage clearly showed the moment she walked up to my window with a crowbar, looked around with the subtlety of a hippopotamus peeking out from behind a lamppost, and, with an unobtrusive movement, smashed the glass with all her might. And do you know what the best thing was? Her face was perfectly visible. She didn't even try to hide it. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of anger and amusement. Of all the people in the neighborhood, of all the houses she could choose to do something so imbecilic, she chose mine, the only house with security cameras at every angle. If Karen thought she was going to get away with this, I was about to show her that she had just chosen the wrong enemy. I picked up the phone and dialed the police number. I'm not the type to get the authorities involved in silly neighborhood fights, but, frankly, This was no longer a normal situation. It was vandalism. And, to tell the truth, I wanted to see her face when she found out she was screwed. While I waited for the police to answer, I went over to the smashed window. The cold night wind blew in through the opening, making the shards of glass on the floor glisten in the streetlight. I looked out, and, as expected, Karen was no longer there. Of course, right? After breaking the window, she did what any amateur criminal would do. She ran back home as if nothing had happened. The police attendant finally answered, and I told her what had happened with the calm of someone who already knew the game was won. I explained that I had a problematic neighbor, that she had been harassing me for months, and that now she had gone completely over the edge by breaking one of my windows. And, of course, I mentioned the most important detail. Everything was recorded. The attendant was silent for a moment, probably absorbing the stupidity of the situation. Then, with a professional tone, she told me that a car would be sent to my house in a few minutes. I hung up the phone and, with nothing better to do, went to get a packet of snacks and sat down on the sofa. If I was going to wait, at least I was going to wait comfortably. 15 minutes later, red and blue lights started flashing outside my house. The car stopped right in front of my yard, and 2 policemen got out, adjusting their seat belts as they looked around. I went to the door and opened it before they had to ring the bell. "Good evening, sir. Did we get a call about vandalism?" "Oh, yes, we did. And look, you're going to love this story." I invited the police in, took them into the living room and showed them the broken window. They took a look, wrote down some information, but the golden moment came when I took them to the computer. I played the recording and waited for the magic to happen. The 2 policemen remained silent as they watched the ridiculous scene of the woman committing the most ill-planned crime of the century. One of them, a middle-aged man who must have seen all sorts of absurdities in his profession, let out a long sigh before rubbing his face with his hand. "Are you telling me that this woman broke your window in the middle of the night, without any disguise, and it was all captured on video?" "Exactly. And she thought no one would notice." "Well, clearly her brain took a vacation before committing the crime." The other, younger policeman coughed to hide a laugh, but failed miserably. "And what's her history? Has she ever been in trouble before?" "Her history? Look, if I were to print out all the ridiculous notifications she sent me from the HOA, I'd need a whole tree just for the paper. This woman has a serious problem with thinking she runs the whole neighborhood." The officers exchanged glances, and one of them jotted down a few more things on his notepad. "Right, let's stop by your neighbor's house and have a little chat with her. Would you like to make a formal complaint?" I took a deep breath and, for a brief moment, considered all the options. Could I just let the police give her a fright and move on? Yes, but honestly, this woman had spent months making my life hell. She wasn't going to stop until someone made her understand that she couldn't get away with it. "Yes, I want to press charges." The policeman nodded and left my house. I followed, curious to see how the next scene would unfold. They crossed the street and knocked on Karen's door. It took a while, but eventually she opened it. From the way she hesitated when she saw the policeman, it was clear that she knew exactly why she was being visited. The policeman started talking to her, and even from across the street, I could hear the defensive tone she immediately assumed. It was a mixture of, "I don't know what you're talking about," and "This must be a big misunderstanding." But then came the final blow. One of the policemen lifted the tablet on which he had saved the security camera recording and played the video right in front of her. Karen went pale, literally. If there had been a mirror there, I bet she would have been startled by the color of her own face. And at that moment, my friends, I knew that the night was far from over for her. Karen thought she could get away with it, but contrary to everything she imagined, this story had only just begun. The police took the recording, and with it began a chain of events that she clearly hadn't anticipated. I was still trying to absorb what had happened that night, but one thing was clear. Karen was in trouble, and I was ready to make sure she paid for everything she had put me through. The next day, the police returned to my house. This time, they seemed more serious, more determined. The cookie seller on the corner, who had already become a kind of involuntary witness to all the events, waved at me with the smile of someone who knew something big was happening. "You'll see," she said, with a twinkle in her eye. "The HOA always protects its own. But this time, Karen is going to dance." I couldn't help but laugh. I knew the situation was getting out of hand for her. However, what I didn't know was how she would react when the police finally confronted her. Meanwhile, my mind was racing. I was curious, but restless at the same time. I wasn't entirely satisfied with the simple fact that Karen had been caught. She needed to understand the impact of her actions. Why couldn't I just let her suffer the consequences alone? I needed to make sure that she was forced to reflect on what she had done. For the next few hours, I was silent. I just watched the street go by, and the policemen, now more frequent, made their rounds. Occasionally, one of them would come to my door to ask about the position of a specific detail from the crime scene, but it was clear that they were already on their way. And Karen? Karen seemed to be in her own bubble of denial. Little did she know that the net was closing in, tighter and tighter. All she could do now was hope that the clock was ticking in her favor. But, contrary to what she had imagined, the clock was ticking against her. While I was sitting on the sofa, the sound of a knock on the door made me jump. I knew what was coming. One of the policemen, with a smile on his face, appeared at my door. She denied it. The thing is, when she denied it, she said she wasn't even at your house last night. "Now, we're going to have to go to her house, and everything will work out. We're going to need your help," he said, with a tone that mixed excitement and tiredness. I was ready for the next round. It was time to turn the page and make sure Karen learned the lesson she should have learned long before now. What she did wasn't just vandalism. It was an assault on my freedom to live in peace. And no, she wasn't going to get away with it. The police team headed for Karen's house. I followed them, but kept my distance. I didn't want to be the center of attention, but I couldn't miss the chance to see what would happen next. My feet, silent as they were, couldn't hide their excitement. When we arrived at her house, everything seemed perfectly calm. No apparent movement, no shadows moving in the windows. Karen's house, however, had one peculiarity. It was completely surrounded by high, walled fences. The only entrance was an iron gate, which, in this case, seemed a little sturdier than usual. I tried to contain myself, but the irony didn't escape me. Karen, who always preached the rules of security, seemed to have made a real fort out of her own home. The police once again knocked on the door. This time, the sound was louder. I was at a safe distance, so I could watch the proceedings. Karen, with her heated manner, quickly opened the door, but little did she know that the situation was not like any other she had ever faced. Her security was about to crumble. "Miss Karen," said the policeman firmly, "we've come here to talk about your latest attitude, and also about the fact that, according to the security cameras, you were seen breaking one of the windows of your neighbor's house, which, as reported, is vandalism." "I didn't break anything," Karen shouted, her angry expression already taking over her face. "That's a mistake. A big lie. I don't even know what you're talking about." The policeman looked at the other, who already had his tablet in his hand. It was at this moment that Karen's real surprise began to reveal itself. The tablet was placed directly in front of her, and the recording started. The audio of the recording was clear, and the images spoke for themselves. There, on the screen, Karen was breaking the window of my house with a crowbar. The scene was undeniable. There was no denying it. She looked at the tablet, and her eyes went wide. I never thought I'd see someone so defeated, and at the same time so ridiculous. Her denial turned into a cloak of shame that covered her entire posture. She didn't know what to say or how to react. The police showed no mercy. Immediately, one of the officers asked her to get into the car. It was the end of the line for Karen. I, on the other hand, could only smile. Karen was at rock bottom. There was no escape. What she thought could be a small victory, a simple act of revenge against someone who dared to live in her neighborhood, had turned into her biggest nightmare. I was there, from afar, watching the end of her story. The story she herself created by trying to drive me out of my own home with her insane actions. The police car drove off towards the station, with Karen inside, now a prisoner of her own choices. I didn't know if she was more shocked by the speed of the turnaround or by the fact that she was finally realizing that she was paying the price for everything she had done. The great irony of life is that people often don't realize the extent of their actions until it's too late. And for Karen, that moment of reflection had arrived. The next morning, everything seemed strange. The streets were quieter than usual. No frantic movement. No more of Karen's constant complaints. No visit from the HOA. No threatening letter on my doorstep. It was as if a shadow had been lifted from my life and a cool breeze took over my day. But the reality was that nothing had been resolved. That was just the calm before the final storm. The true impact of Karen's actions would only be felt once all the records had been handed over to the relevant authorities. In court, Karen's story unfolded in a way that I could never have predicted. She, who had previously appeared so arrogant, so immune to the consequences, was now in a situation of total vulnerability. Sitting in the dock, with her gaze lost and her posture slumped, she looked like a completely different person from the one who ran the neighborhood with an iron fist. What happened to the woman who seemed untouchable? The details of the trial were simple. There were no big surprises. With the evidence being presented, the video from the security cameras, the accounts of witnesses who had been impacted by her actions, the history of constant threats and provocations, Karen's defense quickly crumbled. She couldn't find a plausible justification for her behavior. The lie, with which she had always protected herself, no longer had any strength. All that remained were the facts, and the facts condemned her. "Do you have anything to say about what happened?" the judge asked. I was in the courtroom gallery, watching everything closely. Perhaps it was a sense of justice that gripped me. Perhaps it was the fact that finally, after so long being the target of her constant taunts, I was seeing Karen pay for everything she had put me through. But more than that, what made me feel complete satisfaction was the moment when she looked directly at me, her eyes full of anger, frustration, and finally, a slight dose of despair. She knew she was lost. She knew that, in the end, everything she had tried to destroy was crumbling in front of her. The judge, after a long moment of reflection, declared the sentence. Karen was convicted of vandalism, harassment, and breaking property. She was also required to pay a significant amount in damages and fines. In addition, the restraining order against me was renewed, ensuring that she could no longer go near my house. When the sentence was read out, I saw the despair take hold of her even more intensely. The woman who once commanded her little bubble of power was now being stripped of everything. Her arrogance, her presumption, everything was dissolving into thin air. She was no longer the president of the HOA. She was no longer anyone. As security escorted her out of the room, I remained seated, but something inside me finally calmed down. The pain, the discomfort, the fear that she had caused me dissipated. I was finally free. The battle was won, and Karen would finally have to deal with the consequences of her actions. What she did wasn't just an attempt to throw me out. It was an attempt to destroy my peace, to control my life and the lives of everyone around her. But ultimately, she failed. However, Karen's story didn't end in that courtroom. For her, it was just the beginning of a new phase, the phase in which she would finally have to face the repercussions of her behavior. The woman who once had a comfortable life, full of power and control, would now be a reminder of everything that happens when someone tries to play with someone else's destiny without thinking about the consequences. At the end of the day, Karen was just another one of those people who learned, the hard way, that the universe always finds a way to pay you back. Meanwhile, I returned home, feeling a peace that I no longer knew what it was. I knew that my battle was won, but the greatest learning from all this was that justice, even if it takes time, always finds its way. Karen may have gotten away with a lot in her life, but this time, she didn't get away with it. And honestly, that was more than I could have hoped for. If you liked this video, don't forget to leave a comment and a like to support the channel.